So hopefully, hopefully this one will record correctly and get get whatever organized correctly so I can get it onto YouTube. That said, um, so last time I went over aperture and shutter again, the aperture and shutter speeds. And again, I want you to learn the numbers I gave you, the whole stop numbers. And we then put those together and talked about equivalent exposures. So I want to do that again. Let me just get back there. Let's see. Modules. Okay, so again, these are in the modules, and at the bottom of each module, I think it's at the bottom, you'll see CETA's class notes, and so those are the written out notes about the topics, and of course I want you to look at those and also do the readings for each topic, and those are of course there in the modules as well. So we said that the light meter in the camera, when activated by touching the or lightly depressing the shutter release button, the light meter activates and it will tell you whether or not you are exposing correctly. It doesn't do it by saying you should set your aperture at f5.6 and your shutter speed at 1/1000th. It uses as a starting place wherever your camera happens to be set at that moment, and then it indicates to you whether or not that is correct. And if you're shooting in the manual mode, then you will have to correct it because in the manual mode you have control over everything. If you're shooting in the program or the auto modes, which I don't want you to do, then the camera, it may or may not even show you the display because you have no control over it. It will probably tell you what your shutter speed and aperture are, but you can't change it. The camera does that for you. And in the priority modes, you have partial control over either the aperture or the shutter, and then the camera will figure out the rest for you. And what it is figuring out is this set of equivalent exposures. So I gave a hypothetical situation, one that's not impossible, but one that you wouldn't find today on a bright sunny day, maybe on a cloudy overcast day. So I said that the shutter is set to 1/60th of a second and the aperture at f8, and the ASA or the ISO rating set to 400, which is it's not low, but it's not an incredibly high or sensitive rating either. And we talked about why we might want to change the shutter speed, and we said that is because we are concerned with freezing or showing motion. So obviously when we change the shutter speed, we change the amount of light entering the camera, but that's not what I'm talking about in this moment, because presumably the light meter gives us a light meter reading that will give us an image that is properly exposed, one that's neither too light nor too dark. But in order to show or stop motion, we need to use either a slower or faster shutter speed, respectively. So if you want to capture uh, the soccer player Lionel Messi uh, kicking an amazing goal at almost 100 miles an hour, and you want that soccer ball to be frozen midair after it leaves his foot, you need to use a fast shutter speed in order to stop or freeze that motion. If you used what we have here, a 60th of a second, if you saw the ball at all, it would be really blurry, or you might not see it at all. It might just pass through the frame and not be recorded. And the faster a subject or object is moving, the faster the shutter speed you will need to use in order to freeze or stop that motion. Conversely, if you want to show something moving, show the motion of maybe trees swaying in the wind or water flowing over a waterfall, a dancer pirouetting across a stage, and you want to show that motion, then you need to use a slow shutter speed or a slower one, because for however long the shutter remains open, whatever is going on in front of the camera will be recorded, and if that is something moving, the motion will be recorded as a blur. Okay. In either case, stopping motion or showing motion, a 60th of a second usually won't really do it. It's neither fast nor slow. It's kind of in between. So in order to freeze the motion of Lionel Messi's soccer ball, we want to use a fast shutter speed. But when we change the shutter speed, we change the amount of light entering the camera. So if I change the shutter speed from a 60th of a second to 1/125th of a second, I cut the amount of light in half. So a 1/125th of a second is half as long as a 60th of a second. And since the shutter remains open for half as long, it allows in half as much light. And so if I do that, my image will be too dark. And as I continue to stop down, it will get darker and darker because I cut the light in half and in half again and in half again and so on. Obviously, people use the fast shutter speeds, and so in order to do so and still expose correctly, to have an image that is neither too light nor too dark, we change the size of the aperture to compensate for the change in the amount of light entering the camera through the shutter. So if we reduce the amount of light entering the camera through the shutter, we will increase the amount of light entering the camera through the aperture. So as the shutter speeds get faster, the apertures get larger to compensate for that. So if I change the shutter speed from a 60th of a second to 1/125th of a second, I'll change the aperture from f8 to f5.6 to compensate for that. So remember that the f-stops, the smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture, and the larger the f-stop number, the smaller the physical size or the diameter of the aperture. So this combination of numbers, 1/125th of a second at f5.6, allows in the same overall amount of light as a 60th of a second at f8 does. In this case, we're using a faster shutter speed and letting less light in through the shutter, but we're using a larger aperture and letting more light in through the aperture. And so I can fill in the rest of the numbers as I did here. And those numbers, or the extent of them, is determined by the number of f-stops that my lens has. So the maximum aperture on this lens is actually a little larger than f2. It's f1.7, if you can see that on the outer rim there, around the outer element. But for ease, we'll say it's f2 because that's the largest whole stop number on this lens. So this lens opens up to f2, that's open, and then it stops down to f22. So I have all of those f-stops available to me. And there are almost always more shutter speeds than there are apertures. So the largest aperture I have is f2, and so that means the fastest shutter speed that I can make use of and expose correctly is 1/1000th of a second. Beyond that, since I no longer have more apertures, any larger f-stops to open up to, I cannot make use of 1/2000th of a second and expose correctly. So my camera, especially my film camera, will certainly allow me to continue to change the shutter speeds, but now I can no longer compensate for that by opening up the apertures. So if I change the shutter speed from 1/1000th of a second to 1/2000th of a second, now my image will be underexposed by one stop. It will have half as much light as it is supposed to have. In the other direction, if I change the shutter speed from a 60th of a second to a 30th of a second, now I'm letting in too much light. So a 30th of a second is twice as long as a 60th of a second, and it therefore allows in twice as much light. And so if I just change my shutter speed to a 30th of a second from a 60th of a second, my image will be too bright. It will be overexposed. And so to compensate for that, I change my aperture from a larger to a smaller aperture. So I've changed it from f8 to f11, and then f16 at a 15th of a second, and f22 at an 1/8 of a second. My lens doesn't stop down beyond f22. The next whole stop is f32, and then f44. But this lens does not do that. So I have 8 equivalent exposures available to me. And that number is determined by the number of whole stop f-stops that my lens has, that my lens is capable of. If it had f32, if it stopped down to f32, then I could make use of a 1/4 of a second and still expose correctly, but it doesn't, so I cannot. And if I then changed the shutter speed to a 1/4 of a second, I would be overexposing by one stop or by 2 stops if I go to half a second. Okay. So again, these are called equivalent exposures, and all of these sets of numbers let in the same overall amount of light. So my light meter said in this, again, hypothetical situation, so don't memorize these combinations of numbers, but my light meter said that a 60th of a second at f8 was correct. And in this case, I trust my light meter, I believe what it says, but I don't want to use that specific combination of numbers. And so I have these other equivalent exposures available to me so that I can use a faster, slower shutter speed and still expose correctly. Okay. Any questions? Anybody?
I actually have one.
Yes, Amy.
Are these on Canvas, these notes?
Yes, as I said.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you go
'Cause
into, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, because I don't think I don't see it under the modules.
So in the
Um,
modules
these notes in
under,
particular, the exhibit.
so it should be, let me go back and
Mm-hmm.
show you, and hang on, I have to, every time I change the page, I have to do a new share.
Oh,
So under the modules, can you see the
uh-huh.
modules now?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
First one's Lightroom, then Resources, Zoom meeting invitations, Basics, Lens, controlling the light entering the camera, and then equivalent exposures. And under that, it says see
Okay.
this class
Cause
codes, and that's what we're looking at right now. Okay.
okay. Cause I don't think the equivalent exposures is coming up on mine.
Really?
But yeah,
That's.
maybe it's just my
Does
thing.
anyone else have that problem? Anybody? Uh, oh, look at that. That got unchecked. That's why.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that.
You're good.
So
No,
they're
you're good.
published, but the
Okay, it's coming
whole
up now.
module wasn't. My apologies.
Okay, you're fine. I
Sorry
see it
about
now.
that. Okay, good.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry.
You're
Uh,
good.
okay, let me get back to that. Okay. Thank you for mentioning that because I did not see that at all. So good. Uh, okay, so this allows me or us to use many different shutter speeds and apertures and still expose correctly. So our next big topic will be to discuss the effect of changing the aperture on the image, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. Um, so let's say this is all well and good, but an eighth of a second isn't slow enough for me. It's not showing enough motion, enough blur. I want to see more. But I know that if I change my shutter speed from an eighth of a second to a quarter of a second or half a second, I will be overexposing because I no longer have apertures, small apertures to compensate for that change. So I can't change the amount of light that I'm working with in this hypothetical situation. Sometimes you would be able to. But I'm outside photographing and I can't change the weather or anything like that. And in this hypothetical situation, this is the only equipment that I have. But there is something that I can do that will allow me to make use of even slower shutter speeds and still expose correctly, and that is to change the ASA or the ISO rating. If you're using film, you have to physically change the film. But happily, in digital photography, all you have to do is change a number, and that changes the sensitivity of the sensor to light. So we said that with the ISO ratings, and I have a little note here, the lower the number, the less sensitive the sensor is to light, and therefore the more light you need to make a proper exposure. The higher the number, the more sensitive it is to light, and the less light you need. So in this situation, I want to let in more light. And so I will change the ASA rating to a lower number that is less sensitive to light and that therefore requires more light. So if I change my ASA or ISO number from 400 to 200, I've cut the sensitivity in half, and I therefore require twice as much light to make that same exposure, the same correct exposure. So over here, okay. This was my original light meter reading, a 60th of a second at f8. And if I change my ISO rating from 400 to 200, I will now require twice as much light. And so now the light meter, instead of saying, oh yeah, that's great, it'll say, you're not letting in enough light. It won't really say that, obviously. But the meter reading will change, and it will tell you need to let more light in. And so here I've changed the aperture from f8 to f5.6. And f5.6 lets in twice as much light as f8. So when I do that, the light meter will say, oh, that's good. And, the little green dot or whatever will illuminate and tell you that that's correct. But now all the numbers have shifted over by one stop. So at ASA 400, I could make use of 1,000th of a second at f2. But at ASA 200, I can now, the fastest shutter speed I can make use of is 1/500th of a second at f2. So all the numbers have shifted over by 1. And because they've shifted over by 1, I can now make use of 1/4 of a second at f22. So I've lost 1 stop in terms of the fast shutter speeds, but that's okay. That's not what I'm concerned with at the moment. I have gained 1 stop with the slow shutter speeds. And if I want to make use of 1/2 a second, I can change the ISO rating from 200 to 100. And then again, the light meter will say, no, you're not letting enough light. So I'll change the aperture from f5.6 to f4. And f4 lets in twice as much light as f5.6. So the light meter will be appeased and will say, that's great. And again, all of the numbers shift over by 1 stop. So now the fastest shutter speed I can make use of is 1/250th of a second at f2. But on the other end, I can now make use of 1/2 a second at f22. And if my if my ISO ratings go down to 50, mine don't, but on some cameras they do, then I could make use of 1 second. Right. In the opposite direction, if I wanted to make use of the even faster shutter speeds, then instead of going to a lower ISO rating, a less sensitive one, I would go to a more sensitive one that requires less light, and the fast shutter speeds let in less light. So changing the ISO is, or paying attention to the ISO is important. The general rule is that you want to use the lowest ISO rating in any given situation that is possible, that is feasible. So you don't want it to be so low that you're really limited in the number of shutter speeds and apertures you can make use of. But in general, you want it to be lower rather than higher. And that's more, I would say, because of the quality of the image. Because when you use high-speed films or higher or more sensitive ISO ratings, you get more grain or more noise in the image. And most people don't like that. Some people do. Some people like gritty, grainy images. But most of us prefer them to be smooth and not to see all this stuff in the image. Okay. So those are equivalent exposures. Any questions on those? So you need to understand what's happening and how to figure out equivalent exposures. And that's not to say that you will have to stand there every single time with your camera and say, okay, so I changed this by 1 stop, and so I have to change that by another stop. You'll see what happens in the light meter, and you can quickly change. And if you're shooting in one of the priority modes, aperture or shutter, then the camera will automatically figure out your equivalent exposures. So let me just get to another page, just a moment. And eventually it might come up. Okay. So, camera modes. Your cameras, especially if you have an SLR, DSLR, you'll have different options. And depending on the camera that you have, excuse me, you'll see, it'll be configured in different ways. Mine has on this dial here some different options. MASP, so these guys, and then a program mode, an auto mode, a program mode. And the auto mode and program modes, again, are the auto settings where the camera does essentially everything for you. In the program mode, you may have some options, which you'll see as icons if you go into that menu, or some cameras have these icons printed on that little ring. So mountains for landscape. It's always a lady with a hat for portraits, action photography or sports, a flower for close-ups, a star and a crescent moon for night photography. And some cameras have a tremendous number of options for underwater, for children, for pets, for any number of things, fireworks. So you're welcome, of course, to try those out. But for this class, I would like you to be using one of the priority modes. So down here, it shows aperture priority, shutter priority, and most cameras have these letters MASP and then auto. Some cameras, instead of the A for aperture priority, may have AV for aperture value, and instead of the S for shutter priority, may have TV for time value. They're the same thing. When you put the camera into aperture priority, you choose a particular aperture, maybe f11, f8, and then the camera will automatically figure out the equivalent exposures and set the proper shutter speed for you, so you don't have to do that figuring. If you're more concerned with the shutter speed, then you can go into the shutter priority mode or the TV mode and choose a particular shutter speed, maybe 1/250th of a second, 1/125th, whatever, and then the camera will automatically figure out, again, the equivalent exposures and set the aperture for you correctly. So in that way, you don't have to do this figuring each time. Okay, so I would like you to use one of the priority modes when you're shooting, or the manual mode if you feel comfortable doing that, which is fine. But remember that in the manual mode, you have to pay attention to the light meter, because it will tell you whether or not you're exposing correctly, not verbally, visually, but it won't correct for you if you're not. You have to do the corrections. Okay. Excuse me. So that's not what I want to look at yet. Okay, just one moment. Sorry, this is slow. So I want to talk about a couple of other things. And the first is what to do when you are in a situation where your light meter can be fooled. So with the equivalent exposures, and in general, when you're photographing, you trust your light meter, and believe that it's telling you the truth, so to speak, that if you do what it says, your image will be correctly exposed, neither too light nor too dark. But there are situations in which your light meter can be fooled. And so here are 4 of the main situations. And the first, to the left, is when you have a dark subject against a light background. So let's say you have someone standing in front of a bright window or bright door where there's a lot of light coming from behind. In that case, the light meter senses all this brightness, even though you have the subject in the center, because there's all of this light coming from behind. That's what the light meter picks up on, and it will give you an image that has been exposed correctly for the bright areas, but in so doing will underexpose the darker areas. So in order to expose correctly for the bright areas, it will say, there's too much light, you need to let in less light. And if you do that, then those bright areas will be exposed, but the darker areas will get even darker. And that will generally throw the subject into shadow or into silhouette. If you don't want that effect, there are a couple of things you can do. The first would be to move your subject if you don't want bright light coming from behind. But if you do, and you want your subject to be correctly exposed, then you need to walk up to your subject and take a meter reading just from that subject without getting any of that background light in, and then back up to where you want to take the image and use that meter reading, even though the light meter will then say, you're letting in too much light. You'll say, yeah, whatever, this is what I want to do. So you have to override the light meter, and generally you would do that by being in the manual mode, and overexpose anyway. And when you do that, your subject will be properly exposed, and then the background will be way too bright. So that's the trade-off that you make. The second situation is kind of the reverse of that, and that is having a bright subject against a dark background. So a subject sitting in a darkened room with just one light source, maybe coming from one window or an overhead lamp, with the rest of the frame in darkness. And in that case, the light meter will say, it's too dark, you need to let more light in. And it will give you a meter reading that will make the background exposed correctly, what it thinks is correct. And that would be a lighter gray. And in so doing, would throw your subject into brightness. That is, it would make your brighter subject even brighter. And in that situation, you would do the same thing. You have to walk up to the subject and take a meter reading of the subject without getting the background information in the light meter's field of view, and then use that meter reading, even though the light meter will tell you, you are underexposing. But in that way, you can expose correctly for the subject, and then the background will become dark. So the light meter reads the world in gray, and whatever you point it at, it will give you a meter reading to render that area gray. And in normal situations, that's great. That's fine, because there's usually variation, some variation, but not huge variation between light areas and dark areas. So the gray is kind of in the middle. But when you have really bright areas or really dark areas, then the light meter can be fooled in terms of the effect that you want. So the next situation in which your light meter can be fooled, or you might not want to do what your light meter says is correct, is when you have a light subject against a light background. So this is a very poor drawing of a white dog against a white background, say in snow. So again, the light meter reads the world in gray, and it will give you an image that is slightly too dark. If you have, everything white, it will want to make it gray. And so in this case, you will need to either know this or look at your images to see if they are properly exposed. And that's one of the really nice things about digital photography, is that you have instant feedback, and you can look and see what you've gotten in real time instead of waiting, having to wait and go back and develop your film to see if you've exposed correctly. Um, but that's something you should be aware of when you're shooting in these situations. The reverse of that situation is having something, a dark subject against a dark background. So, like my hair against my shirt, where, if you look closely, you can see detail, you can see the strands of hair. Uh, but the light meter looking at it would say, everything's too dark, and would let in more light and render everything gray, right? So again, you want to look at the image that you've gotten to see if it is exposed correctly. And often when you're photographing dark subjects, the light meter will tell you to let in more light than you might want. And it will render dark areas gray instead of black, or what we call textured black. So you don't want it to be a black hole. You want it to have some detail. And the same with whites. You don't want it to be so white that you cannot see any detail. You might want, like this paper towel is white, but you can see texture and so on. So you want to have enough exposure so that you can see detail, but you don't want it to be medium gray either, right? And you can see, I think, that as I move this thing in closer, the exposure changes a bit. There, it flickers as the light meter adjusts. Okay. Okay, so any questions on these situations? No? Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is something called bracketing. And bracketing is something that photographers do when they are not sure if the light meter will give them an exposure that is correct. And that's usually in difficult lighting situations. So, in situations where you might have really bright highlights and dark shadows or something like that. So, for example, let's say you're walking down the street in a city and you're walking by an alley and you happen to look in and you see a famous person, you can fill in the blank there, in a compromising situation. And you know that if you get this photograph, you can make a lot of money by selling it to one of the tabloids. And who knows, depending on who the person is and the situation, maybe you could even change the course of world events. But the image has to be properly exposed. So if it's too bright or too dark and you can't see who it is or what's going on, then the photograph is worthless. And alleys are notoriously difficult to photograph in because they often do have very bright highlight areas and very deep shadow areas. So one thing that you can do is called bracketing. And bracketing is making 3 separate images or frames of the same situation, the same subject, at 3 different exposures. So in the first one, you do what the light meter says is correct. In the second, you overexpose or let more light in than the meter says is correct. And in the third frame, you underexpose or let less light in than the meter says is correct. And generally, you'll do that by 1 stop in either direction. Some people do 2 stops. Less than that, less than 1 stop, and the differences are so subtle, there isn't that much point. But as I said, you will make 3 images. So here, bracketing is something you do to ensure that your image is properly exposed. As seen above, there are certain lighting situations in which your light meter may be fooled. The camera can only make 1 exposure at a time. generally using the meter reading provided by the light meter built into the camera. If there is a great difference between the highlight and shadow areas, that's called high contrast, the camera can only expose correctly for one of these, either the highlights or the shadows. When you bracket, you shoot 3 frames of the same situation using 3 different exposures. First image is exposed according to the light meter reading. The second is overexposed relative to the light meter reading. And the third is underexposed relative to the meter reading. The hope is that one of these will be the correct exposure. And so there are different ways that you can do that. You can put the camera into the manual mode and then purposely change either the shutter or the aperture relative to what the light meter says is correct. The second is using something called the exposure compensation dial, and that's this plus minus sign, and most cameras have one somewhere on the camera. Mine is at the top, and so if you look here, this button here says plus minus or plus minus, and when I hold that button in, a different kind of menu comes up that allows me to have the camera automatically over or underexpose every time I make an image. So some photographers believe that that it's better to either over or underexpose all the time by a certain amount. And there's some debate as to whether you should overexpose or underexpose. But instead of having to change the shutter speed or aperture every single time, you can set this dial to always overexpose or always underexpose by a certain amount. And so that can be useful in this situation. When you want to bracket, you can set it to a +1 and then a -1. Generally, you want it set to 0. Okay. Unless you decide that you always want your images over or underexposed. Okay. So, and the third thing that you can do is, if your camera has it, set the camera to the bracketing mode. So most DSLRs have a bracketing mode, and if you go into that menu, it will allow you to set the parameters, like 1 stop in either direction or 2 stops in either direction. So here in these examples, I've used the same initial meter reading again. And again, you will probably have different numbers. All right, but a 60th of a second at f8, and I called that n for normal. And now, instead of figuring equivalent exposures, I won't. I'll purposely over and underexpose. So in this first set, I've kept the aperture, the f-stop, constant, the same, and I've changed the shutter speed. And when I change it from a 60th of a second to a 30th of a second, I'm overexposing. So I'm saying that that is a +1 because I'm overexposing by 1 stop. And when I change from a 60th of a second to 1/125th of a second, I am underexposing, so I've called that a -1. So I've made these 3 images at 3 different exposures with the hope that one of them will be correct. I don't have to keep the aperture constant. I can keep the shutter speed constant and change the aperture. In overall terms, it doesn't matter which one I choose in terms of the amount of light. So down here again, a 60th of a second at f8 is normal. And for +1, I change the aperture from f8 to f5.6. And to underexpose, I change the aperture from f8 to f11, keeping the shutter speed constant at a 60th of a second. So this set of numbers also gives 3 frames at 3 different exposures. So within these sets, the numbers are not, or the exposures are not equivalent, but the one set is equivalent to the other. In the first one, I've changed the shutter speed and kept the aperture constant. In the second set, I've changed the aperture and kept the shutter speed constant. But overall, they're doing the same thing, or same things, to the amount of light entering the camera. Does that make sense to everyone? I hope. Okay, good. So your first assignment, which I will post, is to deal with these things. So to deal with bracketing, changing the ISO rating, and equivalent exposures. So let me bring up the assignment. Excuse me. Just one moment. Sorry. Well, it should be here. Okay, sorry. Here we go. So, it's a 3-part assignment, and I want you to do it in 3 different situations. So I don't want you to stay in the same place and shoot the same thing for each part. So the first part deals with ISO, the second bracketing, and the third equivalent exposures. I don't care which order you do them in. So for ISO, I want you to set your camera to either the aperture or the shutter priority mode. I don't care which. And locate the ISO control or button on your camera. And I want you to find a situation where there are areas of similar tone. So for example, an image of the ocean and sky, or portrait of a person against a relatively monotone background. You don't have to be really, really specific about that, but what I want to be able to do is compare the quality of the image from, let's say, ISO 100 to ISO 12,800, or the fastest ISO rating that your camera has. So you're going to photograph the same thing like 8 or 10 times using the whole stop ISO rating numbers. So 50, 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, 12,800, however many ISO ratings your camera has in those whole stop numbers, because the cameras also have lots of intermediate or in-between numbers, and then you'll end up with like 30 images, which I don't want. So I don't want to see ISO 125 and 240 and 320 and 640, 500 and 620 and all the in-between ones. So what you'll do is start out in the same place, and maybe with your aperture set to f4 in the shutter priority mode. And as you change the ISO rating from a lower sensitivity to a higher sensitivity, the camera will require less light, and it will then stop down the aperture for you. in order to make the same exposure. So what I want to see is like 8 or however many images that you've made, depending on the number of whole stop ISO numbers your camera has. I want them to have the same exposure. I don't want to see them go from light to dark or dark to light. They should all have the same exposure. Okay. And yes, in terms of creativity, it's not the most exciting assignment, I know, though what you photograph is entirely up to you, so long as we can see the change in the ISO. So I certainly always hope that you will think about what you're shooting and shoot things that you find interesting, not just 5 minutes before the assignment is due, standing, I don't know, looking at your shoes, or whatever. But as much as one can these days, go out and find different situations in which to photograph. Or at least look at your surroundings in a different way, maybe. Okay. Okay, so that's the first part. The second part is bracketing, which we just talked about. And so I want you to make 2 sets of bracketing in 2 different places. And so you'll make 3 images at 3 different exposures. One doing what the light meter says is correct, one overexposing relative to that by 1 or 2 stops, and then one underexposing relative to what the light meter says is correct, either 1 or 2 stops. Okay, so 2 different situations, and that'll be a set of 6 images. Okay, and finally, equivalent exposures. And you can use the manual or the aperture priority mode or the shutter priority mode. Do not set the camera to auto or program. So here you'll find another situation and make a number of images. And in some ways it'll be similar, comparable to the ISO images, but in this case you're going to keep the ISO constant. You'll choose a specific ISO rating, and then let's say you're shooting in the aperture priority mode. Set your aperture to the widest diameter, that's the smallest f-stop number, and then make 1 exposure for each whole stop aperture setting. So again, lenses have in between or intermediate f-stop settings, but I want you to use the f-stop numbers that I gave you, those whole stop numbers. Otherwise you'll end up with like 30 images. And I want to see approximately 8. That should be about what you end up with, 8 to 10 images. Starting with the widest aperture, which might for you be f3.5 or f4, then 5.6, f8, f11, f16, f22, maybe f32 if your lens opens up that far. So I want to see, again, the images the same in terms of composition and the same in terms of exposure. So they shouldn't go from light to dark or dark to light. They should be the same because since you're in a priority mode, you choose the aperture and the camera will automatically set the proper shutter speed for you. So you shouldn't have any over or underexposed images. One thing to be careful about is to think about the ISO rating for the situation in which you're photographing. So if you have a lot of light, you want to set the ISO to a low rating, like 100 or 200. If you're photographing in a limited or low light situation, you'll want to use a higher speed or a higher ISO rating that requires less light. And if you don't do that, then you will be limited in the shutter speeds and apertures that you can make use of. So that's something that you need to pay attention to. Okay, so I would like you to turn these in. They'll be due on Tuesday, and that is next Tuesday, which is the 14th, I think, of July. If you want to turn them in earlier, that's fine. But the assignment, and you'll turn them in this way, and I will post this. So I want you to make a folder. Here we go. Create a folder entitled with your name, first and last, and assignment number 1. And within that folder, create 3 new folders, one for each set of images. So as you can see here, I think, I've put my name here, Sita Bhattacharjee number 1 for assignment number 1, and then bracketing equivalent exposures and ISO. And as I said, I don't care about the order in which you list them, this alphabetize them. So 3 folders, one for each section, and then within each folder you will place the images for that section and entitle them with their respective subjects. So entitle the folders and then entitle the images. So as you can see here in this example, these are the ISO images, and I've changed the title from like DS 2541 or whatever the name is to the ISO ratings. So 100, 2, 4, 8, and so on, as high as my camera happens to go. And so again, I'll entitle each image with respect to what it's showing. So under equivalent exposures, if you're changing the f-stop, then just put the f-stop numbers in the title. For bracketing, you can do normal and then +1, or n for normal, whatever, and then a +1 or -1, or overexposed, underexposed, however you want to show it. I would expect most of you to be shooting JPEGs, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and that's fine. So JPEG images are fine if you shoot in RAW, and again, I'll talk about that in a moment. You may submit RAW as well, or if you want to convert them to JPEG, that's great. Finally, after you have made this folder, and I'll list this here, you need to zip the folder. You need to compress it. And so in order to do that, let's see, let me do this. So you will do a left click, and when you do that, a menu comes up, at least on Macs, and one of the choices it'll go open a new tab, move to trash, and then get info, rename, and then compress. And you want to compress it. Okay, so again, you do a left click, and on Mac, that is, you hit Control, the Control button, and then you compress that folder. Once it's compressed, you load it to Canvas. So in Canvas, you will go to, let me just go there. Maybe I'll get there. Here we go. So you go to Assignments. You'll go to Assignments. Why is it not showing that? Here we go. All right. And the first assignment here says Assignment 1, bracketing ISO and equivalent exposures. And when you click on it, you get this. The assignment comes up, and because I haven't set that correctly, it won't come up entirely for you. Okay, so let me just go to the student view so we can take a look at that. Okay, so what you should see is this. It says assignment number 1, bracketing ISO and equivalent exposures. And to the right of that is a button that says submit assignment. And when you click on that, another window comes up. And you choose the file, and the file you'll choose will be that zipped folder of yours. So the compressed folder that you made. And you choose it, and it will appear, hopefully, and then you'll hit submit assignment, and you will have submitted your assignment. And I will then look at them and grade them, and then we'll talk about them. Okay.
Oh, I have a question for
Yeah.
our assignment.
Yep.
So basically for the first and third ones,
Mm-hmm.
we should pretty much have the same exact pictures, right?
That's correct. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, and then for the third one, how many pictures did you want us to take?
So for bracketing, I want you to take 2 sets of 3. So 2 sets for bracketing. And so within each set, you'll make it, 3 images, one normally exposed, one overexposed, and the third underexposed for a total of
Oh, I
6
meant
images.
for equivalent exposures.
Oh, so the equivalent, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, how many did you want us to take for
That will be
equivalent?
determined by the number of whole stop f-stop numbers your lens has. Okay.
Oh, wait. Whole stop F?
F-stop numbers, so the aperture
Oh,
setting.
okay.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
So start at the widest open, like f, whatever the largest aperture your lens happens to have. Mine is f2. Yours may be f3.5 or f4. So probably you'll start at f4. So mine goes from f2 to f22, and that's 8 stops. So I would have 8 equivalent exposures if I did that assignment with this lens. Okay.
Okay, for sure. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? No. So the assignment is posted in assignments, and I will post an announcement for those of you who are not here today. Most of you, or half of you, I guess, are. So again, there was a problem. I don't know why, but a problem with either the recording of the last session or the way it was compressed, or I don't know what happened, but the file type was not, it was damaged somehow or corrupted, and so it will not load. So my apologies, but everything that I talked about last time I reviewed today. So hopefully today's recording will be okay. All right. Okay, any questions?
Yeah, really quickly. Right now in our assignments tab, I think all of us are seeing that the assignment's due tomorrow. Will that due date be updated?
Yes, it will. And it's open
Okay.
till the end of August, so don't worry. But
Okay.
yes, yeah, I will change that. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Moving on. So I asked you guys to shoot some images so that we can load them into Lightroom. How many of you do not have Lightroom yet?
I was just actually about to ask about Lightroom, about the link that was sent out by the dean, or because from the other day, like that link wasn't working.
So I sent an email with a new link.
Okay.
Did you guys get that? I hope. Maybe some of you
I think
got
I
it.
saw it as a reply, but I didn't really check. I didn't really see it that well.
So it would have been a group email, not the individual ones thanking you for telling me, about your Adobe ID, but I sent out another group email that should have had just a basic link in order, to get you to the place in Adobe where you can set up your account. It's a free account. Um, you don't have to pay anything just to get an Adobe account. And so I gave all of your names and email addresses to the dean, who is supposedly getting everyone in our class free access to Lightroom through the middle of August. So what that looks like, I'm not sure. It's possible that when you log in, you may just have access. So give that a try. So go to, I think, go to Adobe's site and log in and see what you've got. Okay. And in the meantime, I'll check in again with the dean and see what he's gotten. But that said, I want to get moving, and so I want to show you how to load images. So let me just get out of this. Okay. Come on. Oh, there was a problem, and it may take several minutes to figure out what it was. So there are two versions of Lightroom in Adobe's Creative Suite, and we're using the one that is called Lightroom Classic. So the other one that just says Lightroom, LR, is the Lightroom that can be used cross-platform, so to speak. So you can have access to it on your phone and on your iPad and on your computer or whatever, on your watch perhaps. But what we're using on our computers is LRC, Lightroom Classic. So you probably want to put that in your dock or whatever the PC equivalent is so that you can open it more quickly. So I'm going to open it, and a splash page comes up, and then this select catalog page will come up, and you may just have the catalog that you made, which we went over last time, and how to make a catalog. And that information is available on Canvas. So there's a kind of slideshow almost in Canvas under the Lightroom, in the Lightroom module, on how to create your catalog and the preferences to set. But we've made one, and so I made I made a catalog for this class. So it's Photo 4 Summer 2020, and I'll choose that one and then click Open, and hopefully it will open. Stop sharing. Okay. So can you all see this Lightroom window here? There's nothing much there, but in the middle it says click import button to begin. So there's a gray area in the center. That's where your image will appear. And up in the left-hand corner, mine says Sita Bhattacharjee. If you click on it, you can change, that information. And then to the right, there are 7 words: library, develop, map, book, slideshow, print, web, and then there's a cloud for cloud. We will do the majority of our work in the library and develop modules. The library is where our catalog resides, and the catalog is a list of images. And this will access all images that we import into Lightroom Classic. Lightroom, one of the really cool things about Lightroom is that it is what's called non-destructive. So for those of you who have worked in Photoshop, you know that whenever you work on an image, you actually change the information in that file or folder, and so you have to save a version of that when you work on the image in Photoshop. Otherwise, your original is changed. So if you work in Photoshop, my advice is to always make a copy and work on the copy, and then save copies, and never ever work on your original, so that you always keep the original. In Lightroom, that's not an issue because the original information is never altered or changed. It's as if you have your original image and you put a piece of clear plastic or acetate on it, and all the changes that you make as you work in Lightroom it's as if you've drawn on that piece of acetate, so it never touches the image below. And those changes that you make, those alterations, are saved as instructions or rules. And every time you open up Lightroom and go to that image, all of that information is there available to you, and you can always change it if you want to, or revert to a different area and save that information at that point if you want to. So Lightroom is really great in that way. It is both a database and a digital darkroom. So in the library, this is where we load our images and organize them. And the first piece, or the main part of that, is the catalog. And so if you look at the Lightroom page, it's divided into 3 parts. On the left, we have one panel, and that's where our catalog will be, and folders and collections of images that we make. In the middle will be the image that is selected, or a grid view where you have all of the images that are within your catalog or within a folder or a collection. And then on the right is information about specific images. And nothing is there at the moment because I haven't imported any images yet. So that's the first thing that we will do. So if we go back to the left, in this panel here at the bottom, it says import.
I don't think we can see your screen.
You can't?
We can only see like a little part of it.
Oh my goodness, you guys should have told me! Oh no, I'm so sorry. Let's see. Okay, can you now see that?
Yeah, I can see it now.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, so now, quickly repeat this. We have this whole screen, and it's divided into 3 parts. And on the left, it says Navigator. Nothing's there yet. And below that, Catalog, and so on. And so this is where we'll see the lists of our images. In the center is where we'll see the image, or a grid of all of the images. And on the right, it says histogram, quick develop, and so on. These are these are pieces of information about specific images that we don't have yet. But we will when we import the images into Lightroom. So again, up at the top, it says Library, Develop, Map, Book, Slideshow, Print, Web, and then Cloud. And we will spend the majority of our time in the Library and Develop module. In order to import images into Lightroom, you have to be in the Library module. Okay. And you can import by clicking on the Import button at the lower left. You can also go up to the File pull-down menu and import images in that way as well. It's just easier to click on import. So I will do that. And when I do that, another module comes up, which I think have to reshare with you. Okay, so it now says select a source, and I have 3 sources here. The first is my hard drive. It says Macintosh HD, and then 2 things that say CETA. And the first one is a little, it's a little thumb drive or flash drive. I did have another one here. So a little flash drive, of this sort. And then the second one is my external hard drive, this one. And that's where I keep many, many images. So, you will presumably have images in mind that you want to import. So I'll just choose some here. Those look not incredibly interesting, but anyway. So I've selected a set of images here, and now they appear. And they notice that each has a check mark in it. So that means that every single image here is selected, has been checked. And below that it says check all or uncheck all. So if I just want maybe 3 images from this whole set of images, I don't have to import them all. I can uncheck them all and then check the few that maybe I want, maybe I want to work on, like so. Or if I want them all, obviously I have them all checked, and if there are just a few I don't want, then I can uncheck those. Maybe that one is just dreadful and I don't want them. Okay. So that's up to me. Up above that, if you look above this grid, where all the images are, it says copy as DNG, copy, move, add. And we generally will deal with either copy as DNG or just copy. A DNG is a digital negative. That's what it stands for. And we'll talk about file types next time probably. But if you shoot in RAW, you want to do copy as a DNG. If you shoot in JPEG, you can do that, and that's fine, or just copy, either one. But if you're shooting in RAW, you want to do copy as DNG. And that converts the RAW file into a universally recognized RAW file type. And again, we'll talk about RAW files next time. So these are the images I want to import. And I've checked the ones I want or unchecked them. I make sure that I'm copying it in the correct way. And you don't want to do move or add because those just deal with moving things either that are already in Lightroom. Generally, that's what it is, moving things that are already in Lightroom, or to a place in Lightroom that you've already made, which we haven't done yet. And then we have to decide where it's going. So this is the destination all the way to the right. So you see there are arrows from the source and then to destination. And so last time we made a folder for our catalog and images to reside in. So let me just get to that. Photo 4, summer, and here. Okay. So can you see this Finder window? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I made a folder, and you'll probably want to do one that's a little better than mine. It just says Lightroom. Maybe you want to say Photo 4 Lightroom folder, whatever, so that it's easily identifiable to you. Within that folder, we made 2 more folders, one for images and one for the Lightroom catalog. And so this is where the catalog that we made last time lives. And I made a folder, it says Photo 4 Summer 2020, and here is the actual catalog that we've made. The images are going to go in the images folder that we made. So this is where we want our images to go. Okay, so let me get out of that and get back to Lightroom. So that is our destination. Hang on here. Whoops, that's the wrong thing. All right. Destination right here. So you need to know where those folders are, if they're on your hard drive, on your computer's hard drive, on your external hard drive. This area, this right-hand panel, has 4 sections: file handling, file renaming, apply during import, and finally destination. So in file handling, the first thing is build previews, and standard is fine. You want previews, or these, the image that comes up, to be detailed enough so that you can see it and work on it. 1-to-1 are pretty large, and they may take longer to open, to build and to open, which is fine. But you don't want minimal or embedded in Sidecar. Okay. After that is build smart previews, and you want to check that. And that is especially helpful when we're in a classroom, and if you forget to bring your images, your hard drive with you, because assuming you're working on the same computer, even if you don't have your hard drive with you, Lightroom will remember these previews, and you can still work on them. There are certain things you can't do, but for the most part, you can work on your images even if you don't actually have them there, if you have checked this and smart previews have been built. So you want to check that. Don't import suspected duplicates. You also want to check so that if your memory fails you, as mine often does, you don't import the same images into Lightroom over and over. Also, if you add to a folder, it will show you which images have been imported and which have not. And it won't import the ones that have already been imported. They'll be grayed out in this, in the display. So you do want to check that as well. You can make a second copy. So for example, if you're loading directly from a memory card rather than a hard drive, then you might want to make a second copy at the same time, pulling it onto your hard drive so that you have the originals loaded as well. But that's generally if you have not already done that, if you're not loading from a hard drive. Add to a collection. We're not doing that now because we don't have any collections, but in the future, if you've made a list of images, of collections, and you want these images to go into a specific collection, then you can do that automatically. Okay, so that is file handling. File renaming. I don't rename my files generally. I just let them load as the numbers, as the the camera has named them in the numbering system. Apply during import. So these are things that you can have Lightroom do to all of these images when they're imported. So develop settings. You can have Lightroom manipulate apply certain effects, if you want that done to all of your images, I suggest that you do not do that. Just let them import as they are and then work on them individually. Metadata. So the metadata is the information about your image that is embedded in the file. And some of that, a lot of it, I should say, will transfer automatically. So where the image was made, when, the camera you were using, the lens and camera settings, those are all recorded and stored within each file. However, you can add to that and put your name and your information in as well. So the default for metadata is none, but you can make your own. So let's see here. So I will edit the preset. So I'm going to make a new preset, or a new, here, bring up an older one. Basic information, the copy of the image, you can fill those in for each one. You probably will do that later on. The camera info is already in there, so you don't have to worry about that. The thing that I find that I put in is the IPTC copyright. Now, your images belong to you, period. They are already copyrighted to you. But it doesn't help to put that in, it doesn't hurt to put that information into the metadata, into the information. And so copyright, I put my name here. Copyright status or status, you have three choices: unknown, copyrighted, or public domain. It's copyrighted because it's yours. And then rights usage terms, I put in not to be reproduced without the permission of the artist, or words to that effect. You don't have to, that's up to you. Copyright info URL, so if you have a website that you want to put in here, you can do that. Again, that's up to you. And then below that, it says IPTC creator. I put my name in. I don't really want my address and phone number going out to everyone, but that's up to you as well. Especially if you have a business, you might want to put that information in. I do put my email in, and then you can also put the website, which is it can be the same as the URL, right? And if you have a job title, this will go into every image that you're importing in this batch. So if it has one title that you want to give it, maybe the date or subject or somebody's wedding or whatever, you can put that here. And then when you've filled in everything you want filled in, you hit done, and I'll save that, or I won't. And then here under metadata, the title that you gave that information will show up, and that information will be embedded in every image that you import when you have this set. You can also attach keywords to your images. And you want to be careful about attaching keywords when you're importing a whole group of images, because that keyword or those keywords will be attached to every image in that group that you've imported. So if you have different subjects, you might not want to say that they were all shot in Santa Cruz. For example, if some of them were in Santa Cruz and others were in Palo Alto and some were in outer Mongolia or whatever, you want to be careful about that. And you can always apply keywords afterwards to individual images. so it's not a huge deal. But if you know that they're all from one, one place or one date or have one subject or something that they all have in common, you can put that keyword in there, and that will become attached to the image. And anytime you type in that word to do a search, then any image that has that word in the metadata will come up, and as a group of images, or just one image, or however many have that word. And as you add keywords, as you list them, Lightroom will store those keywords, and then a list of keywords will come up every time. And if you have more images that fall into that category, you can just click on that, and you don't have to type it in every time. The first time you do. Okay. And then finally, your destination, where you want that image to go, or those images, pardon me. And so we want the images to go to that folder that we made that says images. So I want to go, not here. So I have to open this up. Come on. So mine is embedded kind of far in here, but so photo 4, and then summer 2020, Lightroom, and then images. Okay, and now these images will come up. So I already have, I guess, something here. Okay, but I want this set of images here. So it says on the left, the one I selected is 10/16/2018, and that's what's showing over here in the destination. Okay. Just above where I've selected where the images will go, it says into subfolder. Do I want a subfolder? Actually, no, I don't. Not right now. So I'm going to uncheck that. But if I did want them to go into a subfolder within that the images folder, I could make that folder right here, a subfolder. Then, how do I want the images organized? And I have 3 choices: by original folders, by date, or just dumped into one folder. And that's up to you. Because I usually have my images organized already under dates and topics, I usually select original folders, especially for your assignments, because they are entitled with your name, so, in folders. But if I want to organize them by date, I can definitely do that. And now another window comes down, and that's the date format. And you have like a ridiculous number of choices as to how you want the date shown. And obviously, I don't care how you organize it. It's entirely up to you. I personally like to have the year show first, and then the month written out, and the date. But however you want it done, that's entirely up to you. If you want it all numbers or, whatever. Anyway, you choose a date format, and that's how it will be organized if you have organized the images by date. I want mine, in this case, to be organized by folders, by original folders, so I'll select that. And I can now see that they are all in this date, this folder that I had made earlier. So that's where the images will go. And I will now click on Import to actually bring them into Lightroom. And this is not physically moving your images, okay? it is just making a list of the images that reside, I should say. I shouldn't say that. It does copy them into your, it makes a copy into the folder that you've made. Okay, and can you see this? As the images are added, they pop up in the window. And there's a progress slider in the upper left-hand corner. It says copy and import photos. And as it progresses, the bar moves along. It may take a while, so if you're importing 500 images, that will take some time, and especially if they are raw images, that'll take longer. And eventually something will pop up, two things will pop up, and you'll have to check yes. Eventually. I probably shouldn't have imported quite so many images, and 55 is actually not that many, but sometimes it can take a while. So these are, again, what are called raw files, and they're much larger. They take up, they take up a lot more space, and so they take longer to load. And I will go over briefly what that means after these load, if they ever completely load. So any questions on Lightroom thus far, on importing images? Anybody? Not yet? Okay. And at some point you actually will have access, but do you see how pixelated that? All right, now that's better. So you can look at some images before everything is completely loaded, but you can see that they may not be full resolution immediately. They're pixelated. Okay. Well, while that is working, let me talk to you about file types just briefly. Okay. So let me just get to where I'm going here. So while that's loading, I want to talk to you about the digital sensor and then file types briefly. So digital cameras use, in place of film, a sensor. And the sensor is actually made up of millions and millions of tiny little sensors. And these are called pixels. Pixel stands for picture element, and they are the basic units of visual, of images, of digital images. Kind of like the atoms of digital images. And so the more pixels a digital sensor has, the more information is recorded, and the more detailed that image, the sharper that image will appear. There are two main types of digital sensors, and you don't have to know this, but the first is called a CCD, which stands for Charge Coupled Device, and the second stands for, the second is the CMOS, which stands for Complementary Symmetry Metal Oxide Semiconductor. Again, you don't have to know that either. There are two types of sensors that in the end do the same thing. They record the information that enters the camera, that analog visual information, and it converts that information into digital form. So it gives that information a numerical value, It assigns the information a numerical value. And then that information is quantified, is organized into a file. So the information is the information about how much light there is and information about color. Digital sensors are described in terms of their resolution, and that is in terms of how many pixels are embedded on the sensor. Excuse me one moment. Digital sensors contain millions of pixels, and so they are described in megapixels. And so 1 megapixel is equal to 1 million pixels. And different cameras have different resolutions, different numbers of megapixels. Even the most basic, I don't know where my phone is, but like my phone camera has 7 megapixels of resolution. So that's a lot. But the more pixels there are, the greater the resolution. That is, the more information is recorded, and the more detailed, sharper your image will appear. Each pixel has a little colored filter put over it. And those filters are red, green, and blue. And out of 1 million pixels, 250,000 will be red, 250,000 will be blue, and 500,000 will be green, because apparently the human eye is more sensitive to green than it is to red and blue. So that is what gives the images color. Where the filter's not there, our images would be in black and white or in grayscale. Sensors come in different sizes. The most desirable is to have what's called a full-size sensor. And that sensor, as you can see here, is 24 by 36 millimeters in size. And that's the same size as the shutter in a film camera, if you can see that. So that shutter is 24 by 36 millimeters, and that is the size of a full-size sensor in digital cameras. Not all cameras have full-size sensors. So my camera, if you can see this, which looks like a normal digital SLR, does not have a full-size sensor. Cameras that have full-size sensors cost a lot more. And not all of us need them or can afford them. So camera bodies with full-size sensors usually start at about $1,500, not including the lens, and they go up into the many thousands of dollars. Even the 35 millimeter SLRs can cost $8,000 to $10,000 for a body. And medium format cameras, which have larger sensors, can go up into the tens of thousands of dollars, $40,000 or $50,000. So they can be very, very expensive. And many of us don't need full-size sensors. It's nice to have, but it's not necessary. So if you're not making, large enlargements, if you're not printing out your images, you don't really need a camera that has, 30 megapixels of resolution and full-size sensor. Again, it's nice to have, but it's not necessary. So if your images never leave the ether, if they're always seen on screens, you don't, unless you blow it way up, which most people are not going to do, they look beautiful on the screen. It's just when you start to print them out or make them really big that you start to see that the images may not be as fine. Okay. Once that information has been gathered and then digitized, converted to digital form from analog. That information is organized into a file type, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then transferred to a memory card. Most cameras these days use this type of memory card, which is called an SD card. Some of them use compact flash cards, and I don't have an example of one at the moment. Compact flash cards are larger. They look kind of like this. And they were the types of cards that were used originally in earlier digital cameras, and some cameras still use them, but most have switched over to SD cards. SD cards come in different capacities in the same way that thumb or flash drives do. So that card that I just showed you has a capacity of 32 gigabytes. That means that it will store up to 32 gigabytes of information. And that means that it will hold a fair number of images. So SD cards, they used to be in megabytes. Now they're all in gigabytes. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128 gigabytes. I think there may even be some now of a terabyte. My personal recommendation is that you not get just one enormous SD card in terms of capacity, because if you lose it or if it gets damaged and you have not transferred the images, you will have lost everything. So two pieces of information. Have more than one SD card at slightly lower capacities so that you change them out. And then the second piece of advice is to back up your images regularly. Do it. You won't be sorry. And it may seem tedious, but the first time you lose images, you'll know why you should have backed them up each time. Also, even if you don't back them up all the time, you don't really want images sitting on these things that have been there for 2 years. My sister does that. I turn her camera on and they're like images from 2017. Download them, get rid of them. That is off the card. Once you're sure that they have been downloaded safely, right? Make sure that they've actually loaded onto your hard drive, that they are actually there, and then you're going to do something else, and that is you're going to wipe this. So once you've done that, and actually you should do this the first time that you put a memory card into your camera as well, you're going to do something called formatting the card. And so if you turn the camera on and you go into your menu and into the setup menu, you'll have this window will come up that says format card, memory card. Now, you never want to do this if there are images on the card that you have not backed up. But formatting the memory card will kind of personalize the information of the card for your specific camera. And so it's kind of linked to this camera, not that you can't link it to other ones, but linked to this camera, and this will allow the card to last longer. It will extend the life of the card. And your images will be less likely to be damaged or corrupted. So when it says format memory card, you'll hit the yes button. And this camera has 2 slots for memory cards, so you choose which slot. And I'll say slot 1, OK. And then a big warning comes up. It says, all images on memory card will be deleted, OK? And the default answer is no. So it gives you these warnings that if you have not backed up your images, don't do this. And so, do I want to do this? Actually, no, I don't. But if you do, then you have to physically change the answer to yes, and then the card will be formatted. So you want to do that the first time that you put a memory card in, before you have any images on it, and then you want to reformat it each time you put the card back in after you have downloaded your images. And so that clears the images completely and kind of resets the memory card. Okay, so that's what you want to do. So the memory card contains your images, and then you transfer them, and it does that. Hang on, let me get back here. It converts them into a file type. So let me get to the file types. Goodness. All right. All right. Okay, file types. And this information again is on Canvas for you in the modules. There are two main types of files, lossy and lossless, and that refers to how much, if any, information is dumped or tossed out when the file is made. The most commonly seen file type for images is called the JPEG. And JPEGs are lossy, and that means a certain amount of information is dumped in order to make more room for more images. Lossless files include TIFF and RAW. So TIFFs can be either lossy or lossless. JPEGs are lossy, and RAW files are lossless, which means no information is dumped. All cameras make JPEG images. Many also make RAW images. And you can have the camera make one or the other, or both. If your camera, well, within the JPEG section, you can then determine the fineness of the image, in that you can determine how much information will be tossed aside. And so here is why you might want to do that. Just a moment. Oh, here are the file types, sorry. New share. So JPEGs, Joint Photographic Experts Group, TIFF, Tagged Image File Format, RIF, or Raw Image Format, or RAW. So the sensor converts the visual information, the image, from analog to digital. It senses the intensity of the light and assigns it and the color information a numerical value. Okay. Okay, now let me share this. So when your camera is set to JPEG, and again, all cameras make JPEGs, the camera looks at the image, or I should say the little computer looks at the image, and a sample is taken. And then a certain amount of the surrounding information around that sample is discarded. So here I've drawn a little badly drawn image of the ocean with sky and a cloud. And so the camera looks at this and says, hey, this sky, it's all blue. why do I have to record all of this information and take up all of this space when it's all blue sky? Now, we know that there's a lot of variation. Even though the sky looks all blue, you know, there's certain areas that are lighter or darker. Maybe there are a couple of tiny clouds or big clouds. But anyway, the camera looks at it and says, I don't need all of this. Let me sample an area and then dump a certain amount of information around that area and just fill it up with the sample. Just repeat it because it's the same. And depending on the level of JPEG you've chosen to shoot at, fine, normal, or basic, a certain amount of information will be dumped. So with fine, not that much information will be dumped. With normal, more information will be dumped, and with basic, even more. So if you change from fine to normal, the camera will say, I've dumped this amount. Well, let me dump even more, because after all, it's the same. And so it will dump even more information and then write a rule or an algorithm that says when the image is opened, this amount of information will be filled up, or this amount of space will be filled up with this sample of information. And it does that all over the place, you know, hundreds, maybe millions of times, all over. So when you open the image, these rules are applied, and those areas are filled in with the sample information. And the more information that is dumped, the more is then filled with that same information. And so the quality decreases. It looks worse and worse and worse. And again, if the image is never going to leave the computer, if it's never going to leave this ether space, it doesn't matter as much. But when you look at an image larger, it matters a lot. You can see a huge difference. So my advice is if you're shooting just JPEG, always shoot fine. You can always decrease the information. You can always dump more information after the fact. You can never get it back. So once it's gone, it's gone. So I always suggest or recommend that you make the best image possible in terms of how much information you're recording. Absolutely. So I recommend shooting in RAW and JPEG, or just RAW. But most of us like to have JPEGs so that we can send them out quickly, email them, or what have you. JPEGs are essentially a universal file type. Every computer has software that can deal with a JPEG. When you open up a JPEG image, it automatically opens up. My default on my computer is the application preview. You may have a different one, but you have something that will open up a JPEG. RAW files are not readily readable by all applications. You will have to have a special application like Lightroom or Photoshop. But because with raw images that information has not been organized, it's just raw information, a lot of applications can't read RAW. However, RAW files have everything, all the information that you shot. So it's nice to have that. So I quickly want to just talk to you about what happens when you change the way you're shooting in terms of the quality. So in order to change the type of files you're making, you may have to go into the menu, or there may be a button on the back of your camera that mine says qual, Q-U-A-L for quality. And when I push that in, I then have another menu thing that comes up on the LCD, and it says RAW, And then when I use this little rotating ring, it goes to fine and then normal and basic. And then I can do raw and fine, or raw and normal, raw and basic. So when it's in raw, it tells me how many frames I can make on this card. Now I have some images on it already, but it says that I can make another 595 images just in raw, which is a fair number. If I change to JPEG fine, I can now make 1,300 images. So I can make about twice as many images if I change from RAW to JPEG. If I change from fine to normal, that is, more information is dumped, now I can make 2,700 images. The number I can make has doubled again, which also indicates that half of that information has been dumped. And then down to basic, I can now make 5,400 images. So I can make 10 times as many images shooting JPEG basic as I can in RAW. However, if you think about that in terms of how much information has been dumped, that's an incredible amount. And it's highly unlikely that I would need to make 5,400 images in one session of shooting, and unlikely that I'd even make 595, though I might get close. So for me, it's a non-issue. I shoot in RAW or RAW and JPEG. So again, with RAW, I can make 595 images. If I shoot RAW and fine JPEG, that is, the two images of the same thing will be made, one RAW and one JPEG, then the number I can make goes down to 417. So I've lost about 180, 175 images that I can make. For me, I'm cool with that. That's fine for me. And that's on a 32 gigabyte card that already has images on it. But I think hopefully that gives you an idea of what happens to the number of images that you can contain on a card when you change the quality of the file type. So again, I recommend shooting, if you're shooting JPEG, always shoot the highest quality. I shoot in RAW, and I work on them in Lightroom in RAW, and then convert them to JPEG when I want to send them out. And it's very easy to do that, by the way. But if you know you're going to be sending out images or using images, maybe posting them on Facebook or whatever, then you probably want to shoot JPEGs as well. Okay, we're almost done. I'm sorry to keep you so long. I just want to show you what happened here in Lightroom. So this little pop-up thing came up. Smart previews were built or already exist for 55 photos. Generally, they don't already exist, but you just hit OK. And then it says 55 photos were converted to DNG. You hit OK again. And OK, it stopped sharing. Okay, can you see this? Okay, good. So now these images have been imported. It still says it's building standard previews. That's fine. Now if I go to the grid view, all of these images that I have imported are visible here. Okay. And so next time we will talk about these images and organizing them, and then we'll start working on them. Okay. So in the meantime, I will find out from the dean what exactly goes on with your getting access to Lightroom. This is kind of new for us because normally we'd be working in the classroom, but hopefully for those of you who did not already have Lightroom, this will allow you to have Lightroom at least through the end of our summer session, and then you have the option, I assume, of continuing that. Any questions? No. Okay. In that case, I'll change that due date for the assignment, and I will send out a notice about the assignment for the many of you who were not here for this lecture. Any questions? No. Okay. Well, have a delightful weekend. Make lots of images. Stay safe. Stay healthy, and see you next week. Okay. Bye. Take care.